December has been an oddly great month for game aesthetics. Stars in the Trash launch with its unique spin on 80s animation. I quite liked the punky yet bright look of Uncle Chop's Rocket Shop. Then Spirit of the Samurai came crashing through, its bleak stop-motion take being beautiful in a weird and grimy way. It's not just the animation style, but the art itself that really wows me. The texture of the hair on the central cat that often guides you through chunks of the game, the breeze running through the Kitsune's mane, the beads of sweat on Takeshi's face, and those pauses in between all that bloodshed. It's a super effective way of telling a story that doesn't feel hugely unique in itself. However, in the 10 or so hours it takes to get through the Spirit of the Samurai, I saw the cracks of that facade show and much more heart alongside it. Through that veneer lies a messy game, but one I respect an awful lot. Here's what happened when I played The Spirit of the Samurai. I said the story doesn't feel hugely unique, so let's start there. A boy has dreams of meeting a kitsune in a forest, which is a spiritually enlightened fox in Japanese folklore. With nothing but a cat by his side and a katana in his hand, he fights that kitsune, and this fox tells him the story of his ancestry, sort of, and the sword between his fingers. This then moves back in time to Takeshi, a man gifted with the ability to communicate with Kodama, a form of spirit known for their link to trees. When Takeshi gets in contact with that same kitsune, he's told of the rise of Shuten Doji, widely considered to be one of the most powerful and scary oni. He is also told of his control of the dead. Almost all of this has historical and cultural precedents, and this comes with both downsides and upsides. Being based on a historical tale, it has more of a justification for many of the decisions it makes, but this also makes its story a tad predictable. Oftentimes when you go back to something that will have informed a lot of storytelling now, you can see the threads it's effectively partially responsible for. It's a story that's interesting to watch unfold, not because of the minutiae of the grander tale, but because of the way the story is told. In seeing the team behind the Spirit of the Samurai's interpretation of medieval Japan and its many evil entities, it allows them to flex their creative muscles. Part of how that is done is through that distinctive visual style. There's something so endearingly geeky about the specific ways that the Spirit of the Samurai learns from Ray Harryhausen's interpretation of skeletons in Jason and the Argonauts or Kali in The Golden Voyage of Sinbad. Everything is dark and creepy, even in moments where they aren't intended to be. This can lead to limitations specifically when it comes to gameplay. For instance, there's a very noticeable swap from gameplay to cutscenes, one that is almost reminiscent of those found in the likes of Final Fantasy VII. It's not quite that distinctive, but it's important to note I don't necessarily think this swap is a bad thing. In fact, the blocky look of original Cloud Strife is about as iconic as, well, a certain death scene about a third of the way through. Cutscenes go a long way to add tremendous depth to the world, and the gameplay works to bring you back down to reality again. In this way, the gameplay feels exceedingly grounded and small by contrast. It needs to be, of course, to serve the world and the very solemn feel of our main character, but this swap feels noticeable in almost every major scene. The Spirit of the Samurai is a two-dimensional action game with platforming elements and lots of combat. To serve this, there's a smart move system where you can combine learned attacks to form combos, all of which are achieved by pushing the right stick in one of a few directions. In the gameplay trailer, the project manager for The Spirit of the Samurai says the game combines Soulslike and Metroidvania elements, and this wording, that elements word, feels very intentional. It draws on aesthetics and themes of those two genres, but I wouldn't quite call it either. The methodical combat with a focus on stamina management even more so than health certainly reminds me of playing From Software's titular series, and the 2D exploration reminds me of Metroidvanias, but it doesn't have many of the mechanics of the former, like its death mechanics and its focus on environmental storytelling, and misses some of the exploration of the latter, instead mostly having a fairly linear world with little backtracking and a lack of traversal abilities. I say this not to nitpick or split hairs, but to temper expectations. I think if you like the previous two genres, there's plenty you will enjoy in Spirit of the Samurai's approach to the world, but the tie isn't nearly as close as you might think. Starting with that Soulslike comparison, stamina functions sort of like your health bar and your stamina bar, of course. You use it to dash and swing, but you also take damage directly to your stamina. You have 3 lives, which are effectively 3 times you can be damaged past your stamina bar before you die for good. Death resets checkpoints, aligning with more traditional video games, resetting your progress, including levels gained, items found, and enemies killed. The make-your-own combat system works really well to naturally build the way your samurai attacks without the do 3% extra elemental damage upgrade that plenty of less creative leveling systems are filled with. Of course, it has a bit of that too, with the way you can spend levels, but giving you only 4 main paths in damage, resistance, dexterity, and bow ability means you have a defined path you can follow as you develop and hone your skills. It helps that increasing dexterity also gives you access to more moves. The bow is suitably strong but limited in ammo, and outside of combos, I rarely found myself cheesing my way through fights. This can lead to its own problems though. For instance, a handful of fights, especially as you get further into the game, are very punishing, killing you in single combos. However, despite this obvious difficulty, the parts that annoyed me most are when the game's parry systems didn't adequately reward me for actually parrying a combatant. Instead of giving me an opening to take them down, they instantly blocked the follow-up, which means just charging them and throwing attacks without caring was the easier way around it. This is partly just an oversight, but also indicative of a slightly broader problem. With that stop-motion style can come locked animations, which can lead to some frustration. This is not an inherently bad thing, of course, but it can be bad as the harder enemies get involved and you start to feel the boundaries of Spirit the Samurai's own limitations. For instance, the build-up to the final boss is filled with plenty of enemies that killed me nearly instantly, severely punishing when there's more than a single enemy at a time, partly because of its slower animations and partly because of its 2D structure. However, the final boss went down in a single string of combos. It can get so seemingly needlessly tough when some enemies work outside of the intended macho one-on-one duel scenario that bosses can be stun-locked and overwhelmed in mere moments. Checkpoints also get a little less carefully placed as you get on. Instead of setting them near the altars you can level up at, you are often moved to a few fights beforehand, which means beating the same enemies, leveling the same skills, and then dying to the same enemy until you bash your head against a thing enough to win. It never feels so difficult as to make me not want to play, but it becomes just obtrusive enough in ways that don't always feel like my fault to sour some of the taste of that victory. Swordplay often doesn't quite feel as precise as I'd like for a game that throws so much at you at some points. I quite enjoyed its combat, but it feels uneven at points even though there's much of merit in Takeshi's moveset. See, unlike Dark Souls, where a lot of the difficulty is used to allow you to progress and feel how far you've come, it never manages to catch that satisfaction. Dark Souls gets away with it because of the way the rest of the world is designed. Luckily, this relative unevenness is helped by seeing you in the tiny paws of this adorable kitten, and an extra surprise I don't want to fully spoil here. The different sizes and shapes of the main characters you inhabit give the game scope to be quite weird and brave, and it allows the game to explore more mechanics. This softens some of the blow of the rigid confines of that swordplay. It not only allows the narrative some room to breathe, but plays into the evil and morbid creativity of the game's style and tone. From here, let's move to that Metroidvania name drop. There is exploration to be found in Spirit of the Samurai, and you are incentivized to look into extra crannies to find more gear to offer, which then gives you essence to buy extra potions or arrows. It's simple but effective. However, even with this degree of exploration, it's still very much a linear game. You don't retread old areas with new traversal gear. You don't find secrets in new areas by tackling it from a new position. The game takes you from one path to the other in pretty much a smooth line. The platforming can be a bit iffy. Jumping, like attacking, is strictly locked into a certain animation, which is more a style you have to overcome and not a strict criticism of mine. Again, like attacking, this does mean the game is sometimes restricted in the ways you can explore, and it can even be a bit tough to understand as a result. The darker aesthetic of the game can hide parts to walk into, and the animation style means even when it directly tells you where to go with clear iconography, it can be a bit difficult to follow. You can occasionally use steps in the background to go up a floor with a sign above it, but you have to walk into it from the right direction for that to work. However, once you learn these obstacles and how to move around them, the game can be a joy to explore. The character designs in particular are really charming, some of the boss fights are really well designed, and the world itself is a joy to walk through. I likened the move from cutscenes to gameplay to PS1 RPGs early on, and I say this partly to acknowledge the problems this game has, but also this isn't the only element that reminds me of mid-2000s. This feels old school, not in message, aesthetic, or many of the more superficial elements of older games. I think part of the joy of exploring those old games is working around and growing to love their jank. It's feeling like you really understand this puzzle in front of you. Sometimes the cleanness of games can lead to a boredom if that cleanness isn't in pursuit of something greater. Confused and strange games can be more interesting to explore than technically great ones, in the way we like troubled artists and problematic figures. The I can fix him effect doesn't just apply to people, it applies to art, and it kind of applies here too. I feel quite conflicted in many ways about the Spirit of the Samurai, but I can't say it doesn't have spirit. Thank you for listening to my extensive thoughts on Spirit of the Samurai. I've been playing this over the last few weeks, and it's a really strange one. It looks great, it has some awesome little moments. It's frustrating, but not strictly in a difficult way, like a lot of FromSoft stuff is. And like, I'm a big FromSoft fanboy, so I'm very willing to kind of dig into the difficulty, work my way around it, and figure it all out. It wasn't just a strict difficulty thing, it was specifically the way that the game put itself forward with that difficulty that stumped me sometimes. But it does also remind me of playing 80s and 90s games. It reminds me of the put a quarter in to keep going thing, which I think is quite enjoyable to the right kind of person. And it makes sense. This game, I think, is set to launch on the 2021 Atari console, the really retro one that can play a bunch of old games, which is a really cool project. And I love that this team are doing that. I don't know when the release date on that is, but I think it's still coming. So I think it's really interesting that they would do that. And it's, again, it's one of 50 signs of how like geeky and endearing this team clearly is. There is so much love in here that it's sort of hard to ignore, and I hope that comes through in my video. If you liked watching my video and you want to see more, please do give this a like or subscribe or leave me a comment saying what you enjoyed. It always helps to hear, and I've got a lot of good feedback recently, which is lovely. Either way, if you would like to subscribe and like to show your support, I'd really appreciate that. Thank you for listening.